You should understand that he's ready to throw another million men to their death and he wouldn't blink an eye. But to lose $300 billion, that would make a huge difference, particularly if that money is being given to his enemy to arm themselves to fight back.
But if he just writes off Ukraine, if that sees him walk away from the war in Ukraine, would that dent his superiority in Russia to an extent that the Russian people would no longer have to suffer his regime?
There's no question that if the Ukrainians win the war, if they drive Russian troops out of their territory, the Russians are going to say to themselves, wait a second, why did we sacrifice so much to be losers? And who's the loser here? And Vladimir Putin would be the weak loser. There's the Russian people won't tolerate that. I would say that that's probably his biggest mortal fear is to lose the war, because if he loses the war, he loses his position and he probably loses his life.
And joining me now is Kremlin critic Bill Browder, head of Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, which seeks to ban the visas and freeze the assets of human rights abusers and corrupt officials. Bill, Bill, a huge welcome from us at Times Radio. Thanks for being with us. Talk me through your feelings what Yulia on what Yulia Navalnaya has had to say. She wants to pick up the mantle beyond just campaigning. She wants to continue her husband's work. That's a very brave move.
It's a brave move, and I think it's a necessary move, and it's a totally petrifying move for Vladimir Putin. He thought that he had wiped out the Navalny threat by killing Alexei Navalny, and now all of a sudden he has his widow, who's both a passionate partner of Alexei when he was alive, and now, a very wounded and angry woman in addition. And I think that, and she has an extremely compelling profile, just like her husband. This story is just starting. It's nowhere near over, and Putin will probably regret it.
She's putting her life at risk, of course.
She's putting her life at risk, and she's not allowing allowing herself any time to process the loss. I mean, her husband was just killed, and she's had to like sort of compartmentalize it and go out and meet with politicians and officials in different countries, and it's hard. It's really hard. I don't, I do know how she feels because I've been going through something similar when Sergey Magnitsky was killed 15 years ago, and this is not easy.
He was your lawyer, of course. There's many parallels, isn't there?
Yeah, so Sergey Magnitsky was my lawyer in Russia. He uncovered a massive government corruption scheme in which Putin was a beneficiary. He exposed it, and in retaliation, he was arrested, put in jail, mistreated, tortured, and then ultimately killed 15 years ago on November 16, 2009. And then the Russian government embarked on a cover-up like they're doing with Navalny's murder. And it's an extremely difficult thing to deal with. But at the same time, the way in which they were so horrible and corrupt and disrespectful of the dead, in a certain way, that energized me and others around Sergey to fight for justice. And I'm sure that Yulia is going through the same emotional process that we went through to, and both to get justice for her murdered husband and to carry on his cause.
Where does this leave opposition to Putin in Russia, political opposition? How does Navalny's death affect that? Tell us a picture, or give us a picture of what opposition to Putin looks like.
Well, I think it's non-existent now inside Russia, because anybody who expresses any type of opposition is either dead, in jail, or in exile. Putin doesn't allow anything anymore. And so, you've got to be an incredibly brave and self-sacrificing person to put yourself in that situation. And most people don't want to do that, no matter how angry they are about the regime. And so yesterday there were, I think, 400 people arrested for protesting the murder of Alexei Navalny. But for every one of those, there's probably 10,000 sitting in their kitchens seething at the regime for what they've done, but they just don't have enough. They just don't want to put themselves in harm's way. Um, but it doesn't help Putin to have all these angry people, even if they're angry behind the scenes, because eventually that's going to blow over in some way.
Look, Yulia Navalnaya said that her husband was killed by the latest of Putin's Novichoks. There's been some interpretation, it may be perhaps because of the translation, but some outlets are reporting that she claims he was poisoned with Novichok. Others say it was, the latest of Putin's Novichoks. In other words, that Putin might not be so obvious as to use Novichok. What do you think happened?
I have no idea. All we know is that a day before Alexei Navalny was killed, he was in good health, cracking jokes, and so they did something to him. And then, of course, what we know is that there's some massive cover-up going on. That we're now 3 days after he's been killed, and the family still doesn't have access to his body. Their morgue is shut. It's this is sort of typical standard operating procedure for the Russian government after they commit a political murder to do everything possible to prevent anybody from figuring out what happened. So there's no definitive answer to what they did. And that same thing happened when Sergey Magnitsky was killed. They refused his family access to his body. They wanted to do an independent autopsy. They requested it twice. They were rejected twice. And then the authorities said that the refrigerators were broken in the morgue, and he had to be buried immediately, otherwise his body would start decomposing. And in respect for his dignity, they buried him without being able to do a proper autopsy. And so to this day, we have a lot of different clues to what happened to him, but we don't have a definitive answer.
Yeah, and look, investigators have told Alexei Navalny's lawyers and mother today, apparently, that they wouldn't release the body for at least another couple of weeks, 14 days.
Yeah, and so what they're probably waiting for is for all the traces of poison to leave, so that when they finally get the body, they'll not be able to figure out what had happened.
Yeah. Yulia also says, we know exactly why Vladimir Putin killed Alexei 3 days ago. We will tell you soon. What do
Yeah,
you think we're
well,
going to hear?
I don't know what we're going to hear exactly, but basically he was killed because he was a threat to Putin. He was killed because he was continuing to disrespect Putin. He was killed as a message to everybody else out there that there's the consequence of opposition politics is death. That's
Mm.
pretty much what happened.
And has this been further driven by the elections in March?
For sure, because Putin, he's now running a country, not trying to win their hearts and minds, but by terrorizing the country into submission. And it's not a very strong platform to run on in a quote democracy. And so he can't have any uncertainties, any people trying to challenge him. And even though Navalny was in jail, he was creating all sorts of interesting ideas of challenges. Like, for example, you're not allowed to have a demonstration of any sort in Russia. And so he was calling on all his supporters to show up at exactly noon on the 17th of March, which was election day, at exactly noon, because they couldn't arrest anybody for showing up at the polling stations. And all of a sudden it would be a sign of protest, even though they were all just saying, "I'm just here to vote."
Mm. But you were at the Munich Security Conference, I understand, over the weekend. And my thoughts really are directed to what can the West do about Vladimir Putin? What will the West do? The US President Joe Biden said that the US is considering further sanctions on Russia. In the Commons today, the Foreign Office Minister Leo Doherty said the Kremlin was fully responsible. David Cameron's been looking at sanctions as well. But I just wonder what your opinion is on this. Really, will further sanctions, make any difference?
Well, there's one further sanction that would, which is that when the war started, we in the West froze about $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. And that money has been frozen. But the obvious thing to do is not just freeze it, but confiscate it. Confiscate it for the use of defense and reconstruction of Ukraine. And that would be hugely devastating for Putin, something he really wouldn't like. And we have to do something he really wouldn't like. And so I think that that's the next step in this process, is not to pick 10 names that out of the phone book kind of thing and sanction them, which is not going to make any difference to Putin, but do something that really causes him trouble, and that would really cause him trouble. And so I'd like to suggest to them that they call that the Navalny Act, and all of our allies write up the legislation and seize those assets as soon as possible.
Is that really going to hurt Vladimir Putin? And I'm thinking about his position in Russia. Is it a case of he is almost, well, pretty much impossible to get at? He's not going to like, of course, $300 billion worth of Russian central bank reserves sent to Ukraine. But is there anything else the West can do to hurt Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin to an extent that it'll make a difference? Or do we have to be realistic and say he's untouchable?
No, that makes a huge difference. You should understand that he's ready to throw another million men to their death, and he wouldn't blink an eye. But to lose $300 billion, that would make a huge difference, particularly if that money is being given to his enemy to arm themselves to fight back.
But if he just writes off Ukraine, if that sees him walk away from the war in Ukraine, would that dent his superiority in Russia to an extent that the Russian people would no longer have to suffer his regime?
There's no question that if the Ukrainians win the war, if they drive Russian troops out of their territory, the Russians are going to say to themselves, wait a second, why did we sacrifice so much to be losers? And who's the loser here? And Vladimir Putin would be the weak loser, the Russian people won't tolerate that. I would say that that's probably his biggest mortal fear, is to lose the war, because if he loses the war, he loses his position and he probably loses his life.
Bill Browder, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.